Hi, I'm Austin Langan, VAVP's Communications Coordinator. In honor of October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, the team here at VAVP has put together a quick but thorough PSA detailing the different forms of violence that people within and without our community experience. We've noticed that survivors of violence, especially those who identify as queer, BIPOC, or both, often feel uncomfortable identifying as a survivor if their experiences don't seem universal. At VAVP, we not only believe that we are all survivors in some way, but that being able to claim that identity for yourself is the first step in accessing resources that may help you in the long run. We'll be discussing terms like interpersonal violence, systemic violence, intimate partner and domestic violence, and more. We'll also be looking at how violence within these categories are often broken down into emotional, physical, and verbal actions. Finally, we'll be discussing why it's so hard to believe your own experiences are valid, and we'll outline ways to find local resources that match your needs, including services we provide here at VAVP. Let's begin.
Interpersonal violence refers to any instances of violence occurring between two or more people. This includes altercations following physical, verbal, emotional, and sexual violence, which we'll explore deeper in the PSA. It also encompasses other forms of violence, such as intimate partner and domestic abuse. Interpersonal violence can also occur both within or without the structures of institutions that we'll discuss during the systematic violence section, often condoned by them. This is the case in instances of individual hate-based crimes, sexual assault as informed by cultural misogyny, assault, and battery occurring within cultural systems like prisons, ICE, and more. Interpersonal violence can often be fatal and damaging in ways that are both physical and emotional. This may result in post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, or other specific anxiety or depressive symptoms that may inhibit the victim's ability to form bonds in the future. It may affect the victim's ability to conceptualize violence as something outside their agency, causing them to feel as though what happened and what will happen to them is their fault. This severely limits many victims' willingness to seek help following an instance of interpersonal violence. Even if a victim should seek out help, remember that interpersonal violence is often informed by larger institutional failure. This means that victims of color, LGBTQIA+ victims, women/femme-identified victims, victims with disabilities, and poor and unhoused victims are often turned away by institutions that theoretically should exist to help them. This places them in greater danger than others to be victimized by their abusers again in the future, and can be a form of interpersonal violence itself.
Systemic violence is often ignored in discussions of violence, despite it being both extremely prevalent and often correlated to other forms of violence. Systemic violence, sometimes known as institutional violence, refers to any oppression or marginalization that resides in the systems by which we have constructed our society, economy, and social structures. This may sound broad, and it is. That's why it can be said that systemic violence victimizes the most people out of any other forms that we'll discuss in this PSA. Think of the big isms: racism, ableism, heterosexism, and cissexism, classism, and more. If you've experienced any of these or been marginalized in any way, you should feel enabled to identify with survivorship. Systemic violence is deadly. Some relevant examples include police brutality against POC and LGBTQ+ people, medical eugenics against differently abled individuals, environmental racism, and the construction of pipelines through native land, a lack of critical race theory in schools, ICE involvement instead of a comprehensive immigration reform, a deeply racist medical complex that allows higher mortality rates in Black birth givers, and much, much more. Systemic violence seeps into every fiber of the tapestry that makes up America. Abusers and perpetrators of violence often take advantage of these institutional problems. Hate-based altercations are often at the hand of individuals who feel vindicated in some way by society or political officials. Domestic and intimate partner violence against women or femme-identified people is often a byproduct of a deeply ingrained culture of toxic masculinity. Interpersonal violence in our carceral system is informed by a system that encourages recidivism and is designed to dehumanize its inhabitants. It's important to acknowledge systemic violence in all its forms so that we can get to the root of these other forms of violence. we believe it's also important that people who experience systemic violence daily are empowered to identify with survivorship and seek out resources accordingly.
So, domestic violence refers to abuse perpetrated against a victim by members of their household, including instances of prolonged violence from parents and/or caregivers, from siblings, from children, from roommates, and more. The connecting factor is domesticity. Domestic violence occurs between members of a shared living space. This means that while some instances of domestic violence may include intimate partner violence, not all intimate partner violence counts as domestic violence. Domestic violence does rely on similar power dynamics, with perpetrators taking advantage of age gaps, economic disparities, racial and sexual dynamics, cultural norms, and more to seize and exert power. Domestic violence is at times even more difficult to extract oneself from due to the proximity in which perpetrators and victims live. Victims are unable to connect with survivor services out of fear of being overheard, mail interception, or controlled over shared Wi-Fi and electronics. Additionally, perpetrators may control victim transportation, finances, documents, or even legal independence, should the victim be a minor or live under conservatorship. This makes it incredibly difficult for survivors of domestic violence to escape from the situation, or even become aware of how dire the situation may be. Domestic violence, like all forms of violence, may look different for people of different cultural backgrounds or sexual orientation. For instance, queer survivors of domestic violence often experience outing, social blackmail, coercion, hate-related verbal and physical abuse, and additional mental health problems. They are also limited in access of resources, including a lack of queer-friendly shelters and animosity from law enforcement. Persons living with a disability are also disproportionately affected, often being restricted from controlling their own finances or movement. It is always important to understand these nuances in domestic violence when naming violence for yourself and others.
Intimate partner violence is a term coined specifically to speak to the experiences of people who have survived emotional, verbal, or physical violence from a romantic or sexual partner. Intimate partner violence may overlap with domestic violence if the perpetrator and victim share a living space. Though as this doesn't speak to all victims' experiences, the term helps create distinction for direction of resources. As we've discussed with any form of violence, IPV encompasses a wide variety of behaviors that should be acknowledged. IPV may incorporate inequitable division of labor and resources, such as financial extortion or control. It may include physical altercations, lack of respect over sexual boundaries or a refusal to use contraception, or verbal and psychological abuse. Many people experience IPV without realizing it, as a result of differing accounts or a lack of nuance in IPV resources that capture any sort of complexity. Gaslighting, wherein a perpetrator causes the victim to question themselves or their experiences, is also extremely common in cases of IPV and makes it difficult for victims to acknowledge their situation. IPV manifests similarly and differently in queer relationships, something that many resources fail to acknowledge. Thanks to a severe lack of queer-friendly sex and relationship education, most people don't even realize that IPV occurs at similar or even greater rates than it does with cishet partnerships. Law enforcement officers often fail completely to recognize IPV when it occurs in a queer context. This could be for a number of reasons, though the general consensus is that a lack of representation for healthy queer love and the added stressors of living as a minority contribute to these rates. Signs of queer-specific IPV include threats of forced outing, weaponization of identity, sexual violence between individuals with similar biology, refusal to acknowledge pronouns and gender identity, and unique financial control as a result of economic repression. Victims may feel an even greater reluctance to seek help due to past experiences with law enforcement or concern for their partner's safety. They may also feel as though a lack of queer people in their area means separating from an intimate partner means losing their chance at love. These are all important signs to understand and learn about, both for yourself and for others around you. You deserve to feel seen in your experiences with IPV, whether or not they appear similar to how mainstream culture often depicts it.
The word violence often invokes imagery of some form of physical altercation resulting in bodily harm for the survivor. That's because physical violence is the most understood and often the most sensationalized manifestation of interpersonal violence. We believe, however, that only focusing on one form of violence prevents many people from identifying with survivorship and prevents an incomplete narrative of most survivors' experiences. Whether interpersonal or systemic, violence is never just physical. Emotional, verbal, and sexual violence are just as, if not more so, prevalent. VAVP defines these as such: emotional violence, the use of manipulative, deceptive, or abusive psychology to affect an individual's mindset and mental well-being. This includes guilt tripping, gaslighting, and emotional entrapment, and more. Emotional violence and abuse is just as effective at keeping a victim in a dangerous situation as physical acts of violence. Verbal violence, the use of language to intimidate, abuse, or threaten an individual, may include the use of slurs or derogatory language against a marginalized community. Sexual violence encompasses sexual assault and misconduct, including instances where consent is not explicitly given, where sex is coerced, or catcalling. This may or may not include physical acts. While these are VAVP's definitions, we encourage you to research other forms of violence and define your narrative for yourself. Violence is deeply personal, and different instances may hold different meanings for survivors. That makes it important to understand that violence that takes any of these forms, and any that aren't physical, are still valid and worth discussing with people you trust. You can experience one or all of these and still identify as a survivor. You deserve to have your story heard and understood.
It can be difficult to understand and identify with being a survivor when our society often uplifts one narrative of violence over others. Much of our socio-political system even relies on gaslighting marginalized people into believing that the systemic violence they've faced is a result of their own failures, rather than that of power dynamics of race, heterosexism, cissexism, class, and ability. We internalize these messages, and as a result, are far less likely to seek out resources or even identify as a survivor. These internalized feelings run deep and may cause shame, uncertainty, and guilt when we want to ask for help. We want you to know that identifying as a survivor of violence isn't limited to those who have experienced physical harm. Survivorship is as deeply complex as it is personal. Survivorship and survivor-centric resources shouldn't be gatekept or limited to those experiencing interpersonal violence. They shouldn't make you feel ashamed for wanting to access them. It's an identity to be aligned with by someone who has lived through violence in any form, not a title to be earned in any one way. If you have lived through any type of violence, interpersonal, verbal, economic, institutional, to reiterate a few, then you deserve to be in the company of other survivors and advocates speaking your truth. You deserve to name that experience for what it is and was. Your experience does not have to be explosive, shocking, or leave physical marks to be valid and worthy of aid. Thank you.
Know that accessing resources isn't as simple as it sounds, even when you're comfortable identifying as a survivor of violence. The same systems that cause us to internalize shame about naming violence also ensure that certain avenues of help are only accessible to some. 70% of domestic violence and around 2 out of 3 of sexual assaults go unreported, numbers that only grow when broken down by demographics of race and sexuality. Why is that? Because systemic imbalances rooted in racism, misogyny, transphobia, homophobia, classism, and ableism mean that a survivor is more likely to be traumatized in their search for aid than not, particularly when it concerns law enforcement. Black and brown survivors are often criminalized or arrested when seeking aid, and many LGBTQ+ survivors report law enforcement as being completely unequipped to recognize queer-centric signs of IPV and DV. Furthermore, most marginalized people carry residual trauma from past experiences with law enforcement, making contact with them undesirable at best and re-traumatizing at worst. That's why it is so important to us that survivors know that there are resources outside of mainstream organizations and law enforcement. Researching local grassroots organizations, mutual aid projects, and LGBTQ or BIPOC-friendly shelters yields resources that are often more equipped to assist survivors of violence in all of its forms. Nations Foundation, Mutual Aid Distribution Richmond, Peters Place RVA, the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance, the YWCA, River City Harm Redux, Side by Side, and No Left Turns are just a few such organizations located in and around Richmond. Here at VAVP, we offer direct services, personal advocacy, counseling, trainings, outreach, and anti-violence resources, making sure to center LGBTQ+ and BIPOC survivors. We understand the nuances of survivorship and of violence, and we're here to help, even if all that you need is more resources on identifying as a survivor. If we're at capacity, we can help connect you with other organizations that are similar to us. We are available to contact at VAVP Advocacy and Services at virginiaavp.org or at virginiaavp.org. Our 24/7 LGBTQ helpline is also available, and you can call it at 866-356-6998, or you can text it at 804-793-9999.